Starting with that story, of course. Now, we were told by Sir Keir Starmer in Parliament that a lot of the pressure for a national inquiry was coming from disinformation from the far right. It turns out yesterday that one of his ministers on Question Time said, undoubtedly, all of this has been expedited because of the debate we've had over the last fortnight, i.e. Elon Musk. I mean, at the heart of this should be victims, and yet this is where we are.
Absolutely, and whether Elon Musk is going to take credit for this or whether it's blaming it on the far right, which I don't think was necessarily the best response.
What we do know... That's a politician's way of describing it.
Well, what I'm going to say, Rob, is that clearly we know that the 20 recommendations from the J report have never been implemented yet, and the government's promised to do that. But also underlying all this is across, I think, 50 towns across the UK, thousands and thousands of girls over a long period of time were groomed and had criminal acts against them, rape, abuse, forced drugs onto them and everything else to exploit them, then their vulnerability. And amongst those victims, and we're hearing it even more and more this last 2 weeks, and we should have heard it before, is them feeling that they're not heard and they've not been listened to, and looking at some of the particular circumstances that led to those crimes being committed, but also agencies not acting on intelligence that was coming through, has not been dealt with properly in the public realm. And, you know, that is just not good enough.
Can I ask you, I mean, let's just call it out what it is. People dance around it. When Caroline says the particular circumstances, you know what she's referring to, right?
Yeah, but this whole thing is political, right? From start to finish, and it's not just about Elon Musk and the right. This is also about the left, because one of the reasons that the government had to pivot on their position was because Andy Burnham, a Labour Metro Mayor in Manchester, asked for an inquiry. And the inquiry that's been announced, well, or rather the review that has been announced, has been about local reviews backed up by government. So we don't know that actually addresses the criticisms of not having a national review and whether you can call people to give evidence and you can compel them to give evidence.
You can't compel them to give evidence.
So what is this actually going to achieve? And is this just sort of trying to move on from a news story?
It seems to me that, in a sense, there's a couple of things, isn't there? Because it's almost ended up in the way that it's being seen by those not absolutely directly affected or paying every attention to it. Like the row is between pro-grooming and anti-grooming. Do you find it disgusting? Do you not? Whereas I think what the government has been trying to say, whether it's right or whether it's come across or not, is we've got the recommendations that may help from the J report. We don't want to waste time with another 2-year massive inquiry. We want to get those affected. But it seems to me on the other side, those that have been affected say the problem with that is that they would like to see people brought to trial. They would like to see people that were accused have justice. And is that what this Yvette Cooper announcement lacks, the ability to do that?
I think, look, I think undoubtedly, you know, over the last 2 to 3 weeks, the government are in a position that they didn't expect themselves to be in. Where this all started, obviously, was when Jess Phillips said that she wasn't going to support a national inquiry. The Oldham Council had asked for it. And I think probably the government has been taken aback at not just, obviously, the Conservatives going on the attack and Elon Musk, but also the just public opinion, particularly amongst those victims,
but is that
about wanting more.
Misinterpreted, Caroline? Because Jess Phillips, of all people, has been so pro getting answers and change on this subject for so long. It's hard to believe that she doesn't want justice in this area.
Absolutely.
But the problem is that that's how it's being perceived now. There's a cover-up in some way.
I don't doubt, you know, Jess Phillips' commitment. She's had a lifetime of supporting women who have been abused and girls. But I think what's missing in this is a sense that we haven't had a bigger public conversation about what was happening within particular communities, the Pakistani community, amongst these men, in takeaways, in cab firms, across the country, not organised across the country, but arriving and happening across our country.
We also haven't had the
thousands
conversation.
of girls who were raped and taken into situations that put them in vulnerability.
But we also haven't had the conversation about how these girls were ignored by the authorities.
Well,
this is the point that we are going to, and I think this is. Let's get down to sort of the brass tacks of it. Why are people in these communities still annoyed about the way this has been done? We've had a national inquiry. Yes, recommendations need to be implemented. Why is that? Because there's still that feeling that actually, you know, call it left behind towns as you did in the Boris Johnson era, that they're not heard, that people don't respect them, that actually they are going to be dismissed out of hand. And I think that that's the bigger question as well. And that's where you get to that story of cover-up all the time.
Well, of course, and that's the point, isn't it? And there's stories in the papers today, in the Express, some allegations from people anonymously delivered of things that have happened to them, including, you know, a 14-year-old girl who was witnessed by police, according to their testimony, being severely sexually assaulted, and was herself locked up and arrested for prostitution. Now, the idea that any form of authority could see a 14-year-old as a prostitute rather than a child victim of abuse is staggering. So, and is that about...
And that is about, exactly as Salma said, is it wasn't just one police force.
Yeah.
And they're sort of reacting that way. It was happening across the patch.
Why is that then? Was it nervousness of being considered racist?
I think there were two things going on. I think some of these girls, in terms of the backgrounds, the troubled backgrounds they come, many of them looked after kids, were seen as trash. They were seen as almost like consenting to it in a way, which cannot be the case when you are a child. And then the other side of it, and this was brought out by the J report, and it was brought out by an earlier report by Louise Casey. There is some in situations evidence that actually some of the authorities, whether it was social services, the police and others, were worried about it could stoke up racism within communities.
And the CPS.
And it cannot be, you cannot have justice dealt out in that way.
And leaders who told staff, please don't mention the ethnicity of the perpetrator.
Exactly, Rob.
And where you have that endemic, systematic abuse of power, that's why you have a national inquiry, right? It's not just 4 towns, there might be 50. It's very, very difficult to understand why you have these fragmented inquiries as opposed to a national one.
And exactly that. That's what undermines trust, I think, in authorities and in inquiries. And people start to believe that actually there is a conspiracy against them because we can't be clear. I mean, when I was in the Home Office, we launched a review of the ethnicity into perpetrators in grooming gangs, and what essentially came back was that, you know, it's not definitively one group over another. However, there are gaps in the data, and the J inquiry was basically saying that we needed to improve the information that we have. But until we start doing those fundamental things that, you know, don't sound particularly just, or they're not really dealing with the victims, until we start looking at how we make decisions, how we get information.
On a national level?
On a national level.
Right, that's the important point. It's a national problem in 50 towns, so that's why you don't have...
I don't think this is the end of this. I mean, don't forget, we've got Louise Casey's. I know it's only a 3-month review. She's got a lot of work on at the moment, hasn't she?
I mean, you've been in government. It seems like we've had... In fact, we have. Working it out, weren't we, this morning? There's been a Labour review, I think one every 3 weeks. Kicking the can down the road. Let's just have a review. I mean, who cares about...
Quite a long
people
time in
action.
opposition to form it.
Precisely.
Form the decision-making, one would argue.
I think sometimes when you come into government, you just don't want to necessarily accept what's in the in-tray. You do want to have a look at things. But I think, you know, you have to be clear about, you know, you might take an approach that is a review to everything. I don't think this is the end of this. Louise Casey is a blunt person. She will speak truth to power, and she's done that in the past, and I'm sure she'll do it this time. So I don't think if you like, the jury's out on having a bigger inquiry down the road.
Yeah, well, we've got Sarah Champion, MP for Rotherham, Labour, Paul Wharf, Rochdale, Dan Carden, Liverpool, Walton, Andy Burnham, of course, and now Harriet Harman, who also supports, in her case, a mini inquiry. And the centre of it, Louise Goddard asking for one. Yeah. What more do you need? It's hard to understand.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is, as Caroline says, I don't think this is going to go away. But I think from my perspective, this has to be a lesson to government on how to deal with things when the issues arise and not sort of decide that you're going to politicise it, make it all about Elon Musk or the right wing, but you're addressing the real concerns that are at the core of it.
Wait for Elon Musk to be able to expedite this, when at the heart of this are victims, young girls within our communities with the least power.
And why weren't we having this discussion 10 years ago in this way?
Yeah, I mean...
That's what's frightening, isn't it? That's what's frightening, and that's what's, you know, getting people behind the thinking of Elon Musk's tweets and statements, isn't it? Shall we talk about farmers now? We've talked about farmers more probably in the last few weeks on this programme, certainly, than we have in a long time. This time they're driving tractors to supermarkets, to park in the car park, not to continue the inheritance tax debate, but to say to supermarkets, you need to pay us properly. Now, this feels like not a new problem. I can remember over the last 5, 10 years, many interviews we've done with individual farmers who've been delighted instantly when a big brand supermarket buys up their sausages or their cheese or whatever and stamps it, and they think, fantastic, we're in that. And then about 6 months to a year later, when the contract's renegotiated and suddenly that supermarket is its only supply chain, it all breaks down. But this is across the board, paying for food. Do you think that'll make any difference?
Well, I always think that making sure that the consumer is better informed, makes better choices, can help. But I think if I were looking at this and thinking, how would you try and change supermarket prices, I would also try and understand what's happening at the supermarket as well.
Right.
So, yes, they do have record profits, but there is also that pressure on supermarkets to keep costs low and prices low for the consumer.
Yeah.
So whilst that doesn't excuse poor dealings with suppliers, I think we have to understand where the difference is going to be in this scenario, and actually, can we help the farmers in other ways? So having inheritance tax on small family farms, for example, and increasing that might not be the best way to support an industry that's in difficulty and that's lost out a lot as a consequence of Brexit in terms of the kind of payments that agricultural payments they go on.
Quite a risk of annoying people using the supermarket today, though, because they can't park their cars. Does that work?
I think they're making it very clear that this is not to blockade or be a protest. In fact, I understand that the organiser is encouraging some of the farmers to actually go into the supermarket and buy something as well whilst they're there on the day, maybe to sort of justify parking in a bay and what have you. So I think it's going to be sort of an engagement sort of exercise. But I think, look, I think the supermarkets, you know, they have to sort of, you know, reconcile in their relationships that they do have big markups on these goods that they buy from British farmers. Is that fair? It's one of the reasons why, in different ways, governments subsidise the farmers with, you know, environmental money if they set aside land. Often farmers have to diversify with B&Bs and everything else that's going on. But I think, you know, a lot of these supermarkets, you know, like to sort of have on their shelves, you know, we have British food here on this shelf. They need to show that in actions to support
and the vast majority of food does
it.
come from Britain, and they make tiny profits on it.
Exactly.
And they've been beleaguered and forgotten. And as a nation, we've given farmers a pretty much undivided indifference for generations. And the last straw, which is, of course, what they're called, the final straw group, was this inheritance tax on family farms, families for generations who have produced the food that we enjoy. And that's going to have a catastrophic economic impact on the farms that produce our food.
Well, I sort of understand that to a certain extent, but at the same time, you know, farms are businesses and they do lots of things apart from producing food. Often they'll have B&Bs or they'll have other things. I know a farm locally that has, you know, a maze that everybody comes to. And I was looking at a House of Lords report and this has been backed up.
Trying to run
no, of course it is.
You know,
of course it is.
run
But they are diversified businesses, and other businesses, if you own it and it's a family business, you have to pay some inheritance tax on it. And a House of Lords report I was looking at the other day said, you know, cited that a married couple, you know, could actually have £3 million and not pay any inheritance tax on any of that. Under the rules that are being put by government. So I think, you know, it's not a one-size-fits-all on this. And you have to weigh up, is it fair that a certain part of our community, business community, should not pay inheritance tax? They're not even being asked to pay the sort of inheritance tax.
Because of the value of the land. That's why it doesn't work.
So, I mean, it's the land, but it's also...
saying, if you increase the threshold to big old farms, like 5 million or thereabouts, you know, they sort of understand it and pay over 10 years, which is what's being offered here. These are ordinary, hard-working farmers that are struggling to survive. That's who's being punished. It's not only bad for farmers, it's peculiar politics, unless you look at the constituents and the constituencies where farmers are, and they're not really in Labour.
Look, I think
it's
absolutely right that farmers and the organisations that represent them should, you know, make their case, but also look at the way in which the government's saying how this will affect farms, and if they feel that they have evidence to show that that's not the case, fair enough. But I think there is something about saying that actually in some of these situations for farmers there is a justice in paying some inheritance tax.
I mean, unsurprisingly, I disagree with that. And this is because you're making a comparison that says, OK, we should treat farms and farmers like all other businesses.
No, I didn't say that.
But you're saying that, oh, well, you should do that, and this is their diversified businesses, and therefore they should have an inheritance tax that's applicable. But the reason we treat farmers differently is because they are custodians of the land, and because it's about food security.
And they get subsidised in lots of other ways to support that.
But yeah, exactly.
Even on the diesel they use in their tractors.
The wealth that's tied in the land that then is now going to be taxed at a different threshold, it's not like they can just flog that off. I mean, they might be able to sell it to bigger farms, but at the same time, we're telling farmers, actually, you're not supposed to do that. We want to have these smaller farms. We want to have this food security. We don't want you to be subsumed into bigger farming businesses. So you can understand why they feel they're getting a mixed message.
I can completely understand that, you know, people in a situation where they haven't had to pay don't want to pay anything in the future. But I think there is a fairness here, and they're not being expected to pay the sort of rates of inheritance tax that apply to other people who have to pay that. They're talking about, you know, a threshold over and above. We're talking about, I think, 20%. But again, I think it is important with all these big issues around tax is the devil's in the detail, and they have an opportunity, and today's an opportunity to engage the public, but also with the departments that, like the Treasury and others, and DEFRA, to make their case about where they think that actually maybe this is too heavy a one-size-fits-all and doesn't take into account exactly for some of the farmers.
So a government U-turn, in other words?
No, I think it's just about actually you have to stress test these policies and say, actually, is the information on which it's being put forward as clear as it should be? Is the impact going to be in the way the government suggests, or does there have to be some mitigation or some adjustments to it to deal with the small farmers?
The central question for the farming communities is, does the Labour Party care? Does it understand what the farming communities do, or is it politics they can punish them because, frankly,
well, I think farmers have probably said that under every government of every colour for as long as I can remember. And so I think that would continue whether there was a Conservative government in or not. I seem to recall that there were plenty in the last 14 years of protests by farmers and concerns that they raised with both the Lib Dem and Tory government, and then from 2019 the Conservative government. So I think that will always be the case. But they are also, the government is giving huge amounts of money to support farming in other ways. So it's not just one tool in the box to support
like a missed
farmers.
Opportunity, like something we should be proud of as a nation. We make the best beef, some of the greatest fruit in the world that we supply to our supermarkets and to the rest of the world. It's a curious thing that we don't have pride in the food that we produce.
Well, other countries actually subsidise food. I think in France it's still the case that they have, you know, subsidises for food to farmers, for example, basic products. I don't think we've gone down that road in this country, and other countries have different approaches to this.
Yeah, well, talking of on the international stage, it looks like there is a, albeit fragile, potential ceasefire that's being signed and hopefully ratified by the Israeli cabinet this morning. But it looks like Ben Gvir, the right of the cabinet, he says he's going to resign if that's signed. So the question is, at the heart of it, and there was bombing last night, do you think that this ceasefire is going to hold? And frankly, even if there is one, what that means moving forward?
I think it will. I think it will go to the wire. But I think for Netanyahu, what's important is also his relationship with Trump. I think he recognises that's a valuable relationship. And again, supporting a ceasefire, even though obviously there's voices off against it, but also still at the last hour, you know, concerns from the Israeli side and the Hamas side about what is going to be in the final detail. But as you said, Rob, the first phase is just to get some of the hostages back and release some Palestinian prisoners. There's a bigger way to go to get all those hostages back and get aid into Gaza that it desperately needs. So I desperately hope, I think we all hope it works.
When we saw it said, you know, people are now free to return home. What is the home? for those in...
This is the really sort of difficult thing, because getting that peace deal is the first step in recovery and rebuilding. And part of the deal is about having money and aid going in to rebuild northern Gaza. But I think that there's no infrastructure there. I mean, it'll be rubble for most people who are going back.
Well, looking at pictures of it, if that was your home, what are you going back to?
Exactly. But there's also, for the hostages who've been in captivity, those who survive, to come out of that. I mean, how do you even begin to try and help them repair their lives after a year in captivity in some of the most brutal circumstances? So it's not just about the infrastructure, about people being able to return home. The sort of psychological damage and what that does to potential, relations in the future.
What it does to the mindset, Salma, as well, isn't it? Because you've got on both sides, the hostages, their families, those that love them, will be so much more exercised to feel damaged, fear, hatred even. And on the other side, the Palestinians, those that hadn't supported Hamas before, might well feel, what's the alternative? And so there's a mindset on either side that needs to be rebuilt, if that's even possible, do you think?
I think that's true, but I think also what has been really heartwarming and a cause for reflection is for some of those families who have had their loved ones or been released, the sense of, let's stop this, let's find another path.
We've seen that, even as people have
in
walked
Israeli
out,
society, there are lots of different views on this.
Sure.
It's not just those on the sort of
and
very
I've been
far
alongside
right.
and listened to and supported all of those voices for a two-state solution. One of the challenges here, and it's impossible to have this discussion without people understandably feeling exercised and passionate, and to say the least, because of across the board the things that we've seen. But it's very difficult to negotiate with a so-called political party when at the heart of their manifesto, their existence, is the destruction and genocide of not just the state of Israel, but the people there, from the river to the sea. At the same time, you've also got the destruction of Gaza. Now, we need to think about that. So unless Hamas, right, which is still in de facto political control of that part of the world, rejects and steps away, just like in the Good Friday Agreement, from violence and says, look, we're going to acknowledge the state of Israel, how is a two-state solution even vaguely possible?
I don't think it is. There has to be some form of acknowledgement by Hamas, if they are still going to be pivotal in this in the months and years ahead, to take a different stance, a different approach to this. There has to be, and it is terrible that, for Palestinians, whether in Gaza and the West Bank, they've not been able to sort of fulfil what they want for their families, which is the same as what Israeli wants. The Israelis want for their families is a chance to work, a chance to prosper. But you're right, that is a major sticking point in this, is Hamas' refusal to recognise the state of Israel.
Yeah. The other big international story, of course, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, in Ukraine, coming out with this 100-year kind of pledge. What does that mean for support for Ukraine? What does that mean more than just a kind of best friends forever, shake of the pinkies between people? What does it practically mean in terms of that support?
I think it's partly about just sort of sending the signal. I mean, none of us are going to be here in 100 years, so we won't really know whether that's going to happen. Maybe there's going to be some new drug.
Salma might be, younger than that.
But I think it's like an emotive symbol of support that we're going to stand by Ukraine, come what may. And that also, I mean, look, just talking about Israel and Gaza, at some point, I think we would all hope that the war will end, the conflict will end, but there will still be a role for the UK after that, in making sure that whatever resolution is arrived at, that we can support that. And there's been talk about, ourselves and France perhaps providing troops in if there's a zone within the between the two
and that happens in the event that there is some sort of ceasefire. Problem is, stuff we don't talk about, Russia is succeeding in the east of Ukraine at the moment. It's making significant advances. We're sending $3 billion in military aid. At the same time as, frankly, there's a cost of living crisis here, etc., it's very difficult to make that case to our viewers, to the ordinary person out there who's struggling, that their money should go there instead of staying here. Help us understand that.
I think sometimes because actually, or whilst people can see this as a Russia-Ukraine conflict, it affects us all. If Russia is allowed to act like this angry bear that can just waltz into anybody's country, whether it's in the Ukraine or, God, dare I say it, Georgia or anywhere else, within what used to be part of its sort of sphere of influence, its empire, if we allow that to happen, then it does have an effect on us eventually as well, as Europeans.
Yeah. I mean, Salma, affecting both that and the ceasefire in Gaza is Donald Trump's inauguration on Monday. Donald Trump has said that he's confident there will be a ceasefire in Gaza. His position on Ukraine, we have a sense of, but hasn't come through on specifically yet. And Ed Davey here has said that he should not be allowed a visit unless he supports Ukraine.
I mean, that's not very nice, Ed Davey. He is about to become the President of the United States. And I would just say that those state visits are actually really important diplomatic tools, you know. I don't think we've got the best relationship with Donald Trump at the moment. I think there's been lots of criticisms of him by this Labour cabinet. So it would be nice to be able to normalise relations. Whatever we might feel about him personally, people have different views, but I don't think we should make a state visit conditional.
It's a bit silly. It's a bit silly, isn't it? What we're going to throw in some tickets to the Tower of London as well. You know, I mean, it's a bit silly, really, that Trump is going to say, do you know what? I'll change my position on this and I'll do this.
Don't tell you might want to buy it.
Very quickly, I just want to sneak in, talking of Trump, Tower of London and prisons. His official portrait for his inauguration, you already saw in the news and we spotted, is very similar to his mugshot. Now, a lot of politicians coming across the Prime Minister would cheer away from having their mugshot shown anywhere, and yet he's picked. The one on the left, by the way, just in case, is the official portrait, isn't it? Yeah. And the mugshot is the one on the right. What do you make of that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just blue steel, isn't it? It's his photo face.
Blue steel?
Yeah.
The look.
It's the way that I go into a trout pout whenever there's a selfie opportunity. That's what...
Blue steel as a model. He should be modelling his balaclava.
It's just his version of it, isn't it?
It is.
Don't you have a photo? Do you not have a photo face?
There it is.
There's just like one angle that you do when the camera turns up. That's his.
My smile is always a bit red rum, but some younger people don't know. It's just really horsey. It's just always like that. So I don't know whether that works with it. It's not blue steel, is it? I don't know what it is.
What's Rob's photo face?
He has, as I said, he has got better lighting in the latest version.